So Matt is coming up to speak to us later on servant leadership, which should be very interesting to hear. But at the moment we do have a Bible reading, and it's from John chapter 13, verses 1 to 16. Now, before the feast of Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all the things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and, taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" And Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "The one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him, and that was why he said, "Not all of you are clean." When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him."
Morning, everyone. Again, welcome to our Sunday morning service. My name's Matt, just in case we haven't had the pleasure of meeting. It's good to see you here this morning. Thanks for making the time. Now, for the last couple of months, our sermon series have largely been covering the topic of the Sermon on the Mount, which hopefully you've benefited from, and it's been enjoyable for you guys too. Now we're taking a break from that at the moment. It's a pretty good time, pretty like natural time, given I think we finished chapter 5, so it's like a natural kind of demarcation there. So we thought we'd take a break from that and do something else today as a potential one-off. There may be a part 2 on this, we'll see. But for today, it's part 1. And that subject is church leadership. And specifically, as has already been flagged, I want to look at the topic of servant leadership. Now, if you've moved in church circles long enough, you'd be familiar with that term, servant leadership. It's like a classic example of Christianese. It's up there with prayer chain, fellowship lunch, and entering into a time of worship, in terms of terms that we just kind of use so naturally, just flows from the tongue, off the tongue. But often it's worth stopping and actually unpacking what we mean by that. And I think servant leadership is one of those terms. In regards to why we're looking at it this morning, there's really, I want to stress from the front end, it's not because I think I'm some stellar example of it, so it's certainly not that, not because I'm great. This is really one of those sermons that you end up preaching to yourself as much as you preach to anyone else. That's the first thing. Secondly, like there's no kind of hidden agenda behind this either. To be honest with you, we had a gap in our preaching series, like this gap made itself apparent. And for school this term, I'm studying Christian leadership and management. And so I had to do like a big assignment on servant leadership. And I found it really, really fascinating and interesting. So I thought, hopefully you guys will also find it fascinating and interesting. So let's talk about that. So I'm really keen to explain what it means and why it's essential when it comes to church leadership. And really, servant leadership, it's critical to our model of leadership here at MCC. So it's built into our DNA, if you like. If you go back to, I think, the original vision statement for this church, that I think dates probably back to the 80s, maybe even 70s, servant leadership is mentioned there as one of the kind of key essentials of how we go about doing church. So it's baked in to our culture, I'd say. And hopefully, this will be useful for people, if for no other reason, in that it'll help you think and pray about future leaders for this church, for MCC. What should future leaders look like? when we're encouraging potential leaders, what are we encouraging people to kind of aspire to and strive for? Hopefully, they'll have this trait of servant leadership. So that's a little bit of background as to why we're looking at this morning. So first of all, what is servant leadership? What do we mean? Now, perhaps surprisingly, or at least I found this really surprising when I came across it, the term servant leadership was actually first coined by a guy called Robert Greenleaf back in the 70s, so almost 30 years ago now. And as far as I've been able to make out via some kind of a half-hearted Google research, I don't think Greenleaf was a Christian either. So again, he coined this term, but I don't think he was a Christian. And he wrote this: "The servant leader is servant first. Becoming a servant leader begins with a natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. That person is sharply different from one who is leader first. And the difference manifests itself in the care taken by the servant first to make sure that other people's highest priority needs are being served. The best test, and the most difficult to administer, is this: do those served grow as persons? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to become servants?" So that's like the direct, I suppose, consequence that Greenleaf identified as being behind a servant leader's actions. There should be growth in the people that are being served, that you're leading and serving at the same time. So you can see right off the bat, there's lots of natural overlap there with Christianity. And some of Greenleaf's critics have pointed out, that though he may have been the first person to kind of coin that phrase, identify it, write a book, get a publishing deal, etc., it was originally best demonstrated by Jesus and and particularly some of the people there in the early church. And it's been kind of aspired to and modelled all through the history of Christianity. But he was the guy who made it popular. So in a church context, servant leaders are called by God to put away concern for what you could call regular status. And by regular status, I'm thinking dollars, I'm thinking fame, adoration, and even envy from others. And instead, putting all that stuff aside, to self-sacrificially serve the church. So its theological basis and the supreme example that we see is in that account of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples that Helen read out before from John chapter 13. That, if you like, is the kind of pinnacle example. But you see the concept in other passages throughout the New Testament too. So if you want to see, again, that component of self-sacrificial service highlighted for the sake of others, then you're looking at passages such as Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 to 6, and also Mark chapter 10, verses 43 to 44. So that's one way of getting at what Scripture means by servant leadership. Another way is to look at the actual Greek terms that are translated into servant or even slave in English. And this is really interesting because the terms that are translated into leader in the Old and New Testament, they are comparatively rare compared to those rendered servant. So if you're looking at total volume of mentions of leader versus servant or slave, it's much heavier over the slave/servant, if you like, part of the equation. So the emphasis is there. There's much more emphasis on servant over leader. So in the New Testament, for example, there are 7 Greek terms that are usually translated as servant or slave. And those terms, get this, they feature more than 300 times in the New Testament, more than 300 times in the New Testament alone. And here they are. So we've got Diakonos, doulos, pious, sandoulos, oiketes, therapon, and huperetes. Now, 2 of the most prominent out of those 7, one is Diakonos. And this means literally someone who waits at a table. Someone who waits at a table. That is someone who's not sitting down, and particularly they aren't sitting down at the head of the table. Instead, they're up and about and they're looking after others. They're serving and they're waiting on others. So that's Diakonos. Then there's doulos, which some of us would be familiar with. And this is the most frequent Greek term that is rendered servant in the New Testament. And here's what doulos means. So in the Bible, it refers to the notion of subjection without the idea of bondage. And that's really important. Subjection without the idea of bondage. So on the whole, while the word doulos was often taken in its strongest sense to mean a slave who gives himself up to another's will in disregard of his own interests, it signifies a voluntary act of subordination performed in the context of Christian love for God and others. This voluntary subordination is manifested in the willingness to assume the lowliest of positions and endure hardship and suffering on behalf of other people. So hopefully you can see there the two common elements that emerge from these different terms. So you've both got like the voluntary alongside component. So servants are servants because they choose to serve, not because they're obliged to serve. So in this context, they aren't compelled, they aren't forced, and they're not doing it out of obligation. That's the first component. And secondly, their service is aimed at the good of other people, specifically the people that they're serving. So they're helping, they're assisting, they're caring, they're working on behalf of the people they're placed amongst to serve. So that's the positive, if you like, definition and example of what servant leadership will look like. However, Scripture also talks of what servant leadership isn't by contrasting the idea with leaders outside the church. So probably the most famous example of this is Matthew, or the most commonly cited is Matthew chapter 20, 25 to 28, where Jesus says, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles," that is the people outside the church, "you know that the rulers of the Gentiles, they lord it over them. So their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant." So servant leaders will not lord it over those that follow them, nor exercise authority in that same manner as the Gentile leaders of the day. So whatever servant leadership may look like, it's not supposed to look like this. It should be markedly different. But of course, as you're probably no doubt aware, self-serving leadership can just so easily and often masquerade as servant leadership. Sometimes it's so hard to tell the difference between the two, particularly in the short term. So often there's that risk that I'll appear to be a servant leader to you in the moment, but that may be only because I'm in the mood for it. And or I don't know how to get out of it politely. And or serving you right now is going to make me look good. It can be so hard to discern servant leadership from not quite servant leadership, both within ourselves and from leaders. So I thought these distinctions were helpful. In short, as service is a matter of convenience rather than commitment, so if it's a matter of convenience rather than commitment, it is used merely as a means to an end. In contrast, other serving leaders, so servant leaders, are more conscious of their responsibilities than their rights, readily taking up opportunities to serve others whenever there is a legitimate need, regardless of the nature of the service, the person served, or the mood of the leader, and without seeking acknowledgement or compensation. I found those contrasts helpful. So, do we serve only when it's convenient and won't cost us much? And I'll admit to this, there have been so many times, because I was thinking, like, what's the kind of like almost classic Christian examples of this? You know, of gently, you know, trying to kind of wiggle your way out of something when it's been asked for you. So, do we serve only when it's convenient and won't cost us much? There have been times, again, I'll admit it, where I've said, look, just let me pray about that, okay? Just let me pray about that. And that's a great thing to say, like when it's legit, but often I've said it, and it's not great when you say it when it really means just let me buy some time to work out how I can diplomatically say no to you, all right? And I can't be the only person who's done that, right? Because who's going to argue with you when you say it, I'm just going to pray about it because it sounds so pious. So if it's legit, that's great, but let's not, use that when it's not sincere. Do we serve only when the task at hand suits? When I think I'm matched to this task, I think I can do it, it's going to make me look good. So do we only serve when the task at hand suits? Again, the classic response, I'm just not gifted at that. I can't do it because I'm just not gifted at that. It wouldn't be authentic, right? Or do we only serve when we're in the mood for it? I'm really stressed at the moment, I'm having a bad day, I'm feeling down, I just can't help out. There's some litmus tests, I think, of when it's true servant leadership versus not quite servant leadership. Now, obviously, like I said at the start, there are no perfect servant leaders, myself very much included. These are all ideals, but it's worth being aware of these ideals. I think it's worth being aware of them. So to kind of summarise a lot of that, you won't actually find the term servant leadership in the Bible. but again, you have those common elements of self-sacrificial service for those being led, the other focus rather than the self-focus, and the putting aside of status. These are all scripturally sound and pragmatically effective. So, interestingly enough, the non-Christian leadership literature bears out that servant leadership, so this definition of it, is effective outside church organisations. And people argue that these elements are particularly critical in our current leadership context, whether they're church-related or not. So Patrick Lencioni, New York Times bestselling leadership consultant, in his non-religious leadership book, The Motive, he mourns what he calls the prevalence of reward-centred, self-centred leadership, and how common that style of leadership is just so common in both civic and business contexts. And he contrasts that with servant leadership and praises the virtues of servant leadership. And writing in Christian contexts, many authors decry the fact that pastoral leadership so much of the time is being exemplified and modelled after what they call a kind of entrepreneurial style that too much resembles a business CEO's playbook. A model that chiefly relies on charisma, taking charge, directing a vision, with all the risky ego traps that can bring. And the thing is, people, both within and outside of churches, we lap this kind of leadership up. We just lap it up. The strong, heroic individual, they can be so bedazzling, so soothing, because these people, they get things done. They reassure me. They even sometimes may save me from having to take some responsibility for leading myself, because these people will do it for me. But often, the trap with this style of leadership is that it's just not sustainable. It starts out a dream and ends as a nightmare, because those same traits that worked at the front end, they often end up undoing the leader and organisation, church, as time passes. So at the start, I thought that you were decisive, but now at the end, I can see that you can only handle things being done your way. In the beginning, I loved just how direct and blunt you were. It was so refreshing. But now, when you disagree with people, I see that it's arrogant and even a little bit abusive. And fundamentally, this CEO heroic leader model, as opposed to the servant leadership style, it's hard to see a biblical basis for it, because it doesn't really leave that much room for a plurality of gifts or the church operating as a body. It's usually one person, and that one person is usually one dude and a bunch of followers. That's how it often plays out. And if you want a sobering but useful exploration of this, I'd highly recommend checking out the current podcast that's doing the rounds, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. A podcast put together by Christianity Today, which charts the rise and the explosive growth in the Mars Hill megachurch, and then its equally quick descent and how that came undone. It really dissects how churches can be undone by super charismatic and talented leaders and the culture that springs up around them. So, we need servant leadership. It's biblically based, it's pragmatically effective, and it's a welcome contrast to many other the less helpful but popular styles of leadership. But still, I'd argue it can still have its faults, if you like, if it's backed up by incorrect theology and bad leadership practice. So it's not without its pitfalls. So first, the incorrect theology. That idea of not lording it over others or not exercising authority. That can be coupled and joined with a view of the church as being organised exclusively organically. And what I mean by that is the idea that everyone here is a leader. Every decision has to be run past everyone, and all opinions are equally valid and useful. And a potential result of this is that servant leadership is seen as having no room for forms of authority that we often associate with institutions. So things like hierarchies, directive power, and chains of command. And this is justified by going back to that contrast that Jesus made between the rulers of the Gentiles and the church that we read before, and his command not to lord it over those who follow and not to exercise authority over them. So you'll remember that verse. So this command is taken at absolute face value, and it's applied to all circumstances, with the only type of leadership that's allowed is the servant model. In the servant model is that of example. So servant leaders, people say appealing to this, servant leaders, they can't direct, they can't challenge, they can't make decisions, they can't lead like that. that would be lording it over people or exercising undue authority. So all they can do is set an inspiring example and serve. That's the theory that people base on these verses. But this theory seems to be a result of faulty exegesis. So in those verses, the Greek prefix kata is attached to both those terms, the terms translated exercising authority and lording it over. And that prefix kata is thought to amplify, like to really boost the root meaning of those terms. So hence, it's the type of authority that was being lorded over others by the Gentile leaders. It was oppressive, it was selfish, it was abusive. And it was this type of authority that Jesus commanded his followers, not so you. It wasn't authority per se. Does that make sense? It was an abusive kind of authority that he was critiquing, not authority in and of itself. So servant leadership shouldn't dispense with formal authority when needed, but it has to be exercised for the right reasons and with the right motives. Next, there's the bad leadership practice that the general notion of servant leadership can lead to. So whilst we've already talked about the increasing risk of church leadership being equated with, again, that kind of CEO, pastor as a kind of rock star model, there's at least one other deficient extreme that can be caught up with servant leadership, and that is the church leader as caregiver. And whilst caregiving is an essential form of love that would make up all Christian leadership callings, those callings can't be reduced to it. Because there are other forms of love, right, that are involved in Christian leadership. So there's the form of love around accountability, truth spoken in love, appropriate rebukes and challenges, and even church discipline. All those things are also going to be necessary for church leadership, for loving church leadership. But this idea of servant leadership just being about caregiving, it's particularly risky if the leader's desire to serve people completely superseded reasonable concerns of looking after and leading the church as a whole. You know what I mean? Church leaders have to keep an eye on the church as a whole. So on the one hand, servant leadership needs to trust people to undertake actions that are in the best interest of the church and that and give people the room and space to exercise their God-given gifts. But that should always be coupled and held in tension with healthy discernment. So again, church leaders have to keep an eye on the church as a whole, the big picture. And it also has to be coupled with an appreciation that worthwhile organisational change is often difficult but necessary. Any kind of big organisational change is often necessary, but it's almost always difficult. And the church is an organisation. Sometimes that's going to have to change as well, and that's going to be hard. Servant leaders also have to bear in mind the realisation that sinfulness, all our kind of common individual sinfulness, it often deludes us in relation to our best interests. So I sometimes resist what I actually know is good for me, and I need people to challenge me on that. And if I was just concerned about caregiving, I probably wouldn't push back on you at all if I thought that was an issue. And also acknowledging that any kind of caregiver relationship has risks around unhealthy dependencies. You're the only one who understands me. Or enabling. You and I, we like each other so much, right? And so we're going to have this unspoken agreement that will tolerate each other's bad behaviour. And sometimes that caregiving kind of relationship, it can turn into really super pragmatic, reciprocal relationships. So I, as a leader, I scratch your back, and you, as a follower, so to speak, you scratch mine. As opposed to I, as a leader, invest in you, and you pay it forward. So you serve other people instead of just serving the leader back. So hopefully you can see, if servant leadership turns into a primarily caregiving kind of relationship, and that care always consists in making people just feel good, saying yes to everything, wanting to avoid conflict and tough decisions that may hurt people's feelings, it can be disastrous, just disastrous. And that approach, I'd argue, it's not really loving. Jesus loved people perfectly, and still he often challenged people. And that's important to remember. So, for those reasons, servant leadership is not without its risks, thanks to both skewed theology and being taken as a sole criteria or aspect of good Christian leadership. So again, we may spend another talk going through what other gifts and traits could be useful for Christian leadership. It's certainly not less than servant leadership, but it's got to be more than just servant leadership as well. Or another way to put it, servant leadership is necessary, but not sufficient, I think, for Christian leadership as a whole. But like I said, that's another talk. So let me finish with these two things. First, servant leaders are first and foremost servants, and then leaders. But they're still both at once, not one or the other. Tim, when he read the draft of the sermon, he pointed out a parallel to the Prime Minister. So it turns out that minister, as some of you guys know, is an English rendering of a Latin term for servant. So prime obviously just means prime first. So it's like first servant, the Prime Minister, first servant of the people. In 1 Corinthians 4, 1-4, Paul can write of he and his fellow leaders being both slaves of Christ or servants of Christ on the one hand, and stewards of the mysteries of God in the other. And stewards, as you're probably aware, refers to the idea of a household or estate manager. So what Paul probably had in mind there was the highest ranking servant of a healthy landowner, like this guy who some of you be familiar with, the highest ranking servant of a landowner. So they'd be put in charge of the entire estate in their master's absence, but they were still servants themselves. Their authority only stemmed from the true master's authority, and their exercising of that had to be consistent and confined within the boundaries, if you like, of their common master. In summary, that's Christian leadership. Christian leaders are entrusted with the gospel and are charged to see it grow amongst God's people. And scarily, we're going to be held accountable to that. So they're slaves or servants to their master, but they're also servant leaders of the people God has placed them amongst. And that really begs the question, is anyone really up to this task? And if they thought so, if they thought they're up to the task, then perhaps they wouldn't really be ready for it, if that makes sense. Like, you know what I mean? If they were that confident that they were going to be a great servant leader. Paul is such a good example here. So he talks about voluntarily giving up his rights in order to win many for Christ in this famous passage from 1 Corinthians 9. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I may win that I may win more of them. But at the same time, he can acknowledge the thorns in his flesh, his trials and hardships, and admit near the end of his life that he's still the chief among sinners. He's still so very flawed. So think about that when it comes to both considering future leaders of MCC and maybe also your own leadership potential. Like these two things. Having the God-given self-awareness and humility to be familiar with our own failings. Again, like Paul's example, so self-aware, I'm the chief among sinners. But coupled with that, out of love for others and a desire to see them come to know and grow in Christ, people voluntarily give up their freedoms and become other people's servants. Even when it's inconvenient, even when it's thankless and there's no glory, even when they're tired, over it and don't feel like it at all. And I just want to say, I know that's a hard ask. I know it's such a tough bar. I was thinking about, the fact that when I was working for the prison, over the prison service, it was just, it was almost too easy to start a conversation at a dinner party, something when you told people where you worked. Everyone was interested, everyone wanted to like to know more about it. And then I started helping lead a church. And then it went completely the other way. If you told anyone about that, it was a great way often just to shut down a conversation. So I know voluntarily or in a paid capacity, either way, trying to be a servant leader in a church context these days is a hard gig. Again, not that much glory, not that much kind of status from it. It's a big ask when there's so many other things that you could be doing with your time. And again, the bar can feel so high. So it's worth stressing, it's only an impossible task in our own strength, but not in God's. This can happen. People can grow into this through God's power. That's the first thing. And secondly, it's worth asking, if you're someone who actually, believes in the life beyond this, and if you're someone who maybe, is gifted this way, has the capacity to be a servant leader, whether that be in a family context, a work context, or a church context, to some degree, why would you do anything else with your life in terms of your spare time and capacity? We believe, don't we, that people are the one thing that really has that eternal value, So if you can dedicate some time helping people both come to know Christ and grow in their love and maturity of Christ. That will really echo throughout eternity. Most other things, they're going to fade with time. Most other things that we turn our hands to in our lives will fade and disappear with our time. Either after we die, at best a couple of generations after. But investing in people through being a servant leader and investing in their growth towards Christ, the effects of that will last forever. So why else would we be turning our hand to anything else if we have the gifting and the capacity for that? Okay, let me pray. Father, I thank you for this notion of servant leadership. I thank you that through your Son, you just exemplified this, you lived it out, you demonstrated it to us, Father. And I pray that you'll help us, again, through your Holy Spirit's power, live that out more and more in our own lives. Help us be sober about the costs involved in this. Help us weigh that up as much as we can. But then help us follow your Spirit's call into whatever sphere of life it is, whether that be family or workplace, voluntary organisations or the church. Help us kind of step into any servant leadership roles that you've marked out for us. And I pray, as we've talked about, help us be self-aware in that. Help us do it for the right reasons. Help us continue to be humble. And in the endless mistakes and trip-ups that we're going to have, I pray that they will just throw us back more and more onto your grace. Amen.